Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I am Carol Eliel, Senior Curator of Modern Art at LACMA, and I want to welcome and thank everyone for joining us tonight, and of course, a very special warm welcome to David Ross, whom I will introduce shortly. I would like to acknowledge that LACMA and I are guests in the homeland territory of the Tongva, and I extend my respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous people who call these lands home. I also want to thank everyone behind the scenes at LACMA who made and is making tonight's program possible, including Vivian Lee and Sydney Terrell in events, Connor Coughlin, Jessen Duyere, and Richard Guerra all in AV, and Andres Perez and Ann Landsberger in development. I always say it takes a village. And now on to tonight's program, which was scheduled around Bill Viola's room-sized video installation, Slowly Turning Narrative of 1992, which was acquired for LACMA's permanent collection with funds from the Modern and Contemporary Art Council in 1995. It is frustratingly, happily but frustratingly, currently installed at the museum in the Resnick Pavilion. We had hoped it would be available to all of you by now, but as you know, LACMA and all other museums in Los Angeles County are still closed according to state, county, and city health regulations. LACMA will reopen to the public as soon as it is deemed safe, and we hope you will come see Slowly Turning Narrative and all of our other offerings then. In the meantime, tonight I will tell you a few words about Bill Viola generally, and then I will introduce David Ross, and he and I will begin our conversation. Born in 1951, Bill Viola is a pioneer in the development of video as a major medium in contemporary art. For more than 40 years, he has made work that consistently addresses life, death, and the intervening journey, and is rooted in both Eastern and Western art, as well as in spiritual traditions, including Zen Buddhism, Islamic Sufism, and Christian mysticism. Viola was born in New York City, and he graduated in 1973 from the College of Visual and Performing Arts at Syracuse University, where he studied electronic music, performance art, and experimental film, and where he created his first video works using the recently invented portable camcorder. After graduating, Viola spent 18 months working in Florence, surrounded by Renaissance art and architecture, and then later a fellowship allowed him, along with Kira Perov, his wife and collaborator, to live in Japan from 1980 to 81, studying Zen Buddhist philosophy and experiencing the architecture, calligraphy, no theater, and many other aspects of Japanese culture that have influenced his work. Viola then moved to Southern California. He lives in Long Beach to this day, though extensive travels have taken him almost every and anywhere in the world, to islands in the South Pacific, the deserts of Tunisia, Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, Hindu fire walking ceremonies in Fiji, Native American archaeological sites in the Southwestern United States, among many other destinations. In 1989, Viola was named a MacArthur Genius Fellow, and in 1995, he represented the United States at the Venice Biennale, 2 years before the mid-career survey co-organized by David Ross and seen at LACMA. In fact, it debuted at LACMA. His work continues to be exhibited nationally and internationally, including current solo exhibitions in South Korea, Belgium, Spain, and Wisconsin. David Ross is a longtime friend. Hopefully he will soon materialize on the screen. He is a longtime friend and colleague of Bill Viola, who has worked closely with him over many years, and we'll hear about that this evening. Early in his career, Ross served as curator of video art at the Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York, and then at the Long Beach Museum of Art, helping to establish video art as a recognized field for curatorial as well as artistic practice. From 1982 to 91, he was director of the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. And then from 1991 to 98, he was director at the Whitney Museum, where he co-organized the major 1997 survey Bill Viola, which, as I mentioned, debuted at LACMA and traveled to 5 additional venues in the US and Europe. Ross subsequently served as director of SFMOMA, and he is currently chair of the MFA Art Practice program at the School of Visual Arts in New York. So we are very honored to have David with us today. Welcome. And I will, sure, I'll just start out with a question, and maybe then you can head into your slides and sort of talk about it with some of your early slides. I know your relationship with Bill Viola goes back to your college days at Syracuse University. Can you tell us how and when you met and how your relationship with Bill developed over the first few years that you knew each other?
Well, I met Bill when he was a sophomore in the College of Visual and Performing Arts, and we both found ourselves in a space at Syracuse called Experimental Studios, which is, I guess, where they allowed artists to work, artists who they couldn't figure out. You know, if you wanted to do something that nobody understood, then they put you in experimental studios. I was coming from the journalism school because my background was in political science and journalism, believe it or not. And when I tried to learn how to use a portable video in the journalism school, they wouldn't let me because they thought it was a toy. And they said, go to the art school. That's where they play with toys, which was kind of a nasty thing to say when you think about it. But I wasn't about to allow that to deter me. So I went over there and met a guy named Jack Nelson, who became a very important figure in my life and Bill's life. And I met Bill. Bill was at that point a drummer in a rock and roll band. He was exploring experimental music. And together we started playing with these new video tools. Fast forward a little bit without getting into too much of my own story, I wind up as the world's first curator of video art at the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse, the city's museum, working for an extraordinary genius named Jim Harithis. And I won't get into how and why Jim hired me, but suffice it to say that I wasn't an art history major, and nor did I understand anything about the way museums worked. And this technology that I was now going to be working with was still very new. And so I needed a friend to work with me. Today, they might call this person a preparator, a video preparator, electronics, digital preparator. But back then, it was Bill. And so in a series of exhibitions that I organized at the tender age of 21, working with Nam June Paik, Peter Campus, Juan Downey, Frank Gillette, in every one of these exhibitions, I turned to Bill and said, Bill, help me install this because I have no idea what we're going to do here. And Bill was game and came and started working with me at the Everson Museum. And together we found our mentors. In fact, this is maybe a good time for me to share the screen and get into the presentation here. Here's Bill Viola. Those of you who know Bill will appreciate this picture because it's a picture that I took in Strawberry Fields one time when Bill was visiting me in New York. The specific implications of this are that one of the first shows Bill worked on with me was when I was assisting Jim Harithis in the first Yoko Ono retrospective, which opened in 1972 at the Whitney. And Yoko was a very important figure for both of us, but it also was the moment when we got to know Nam June Paik. And here's a picture of me and Bill on your stage at LACMA during the 1997 premiere of the survey exhibition that Peter Sellers and I co-curated with the active participation, you almost might call it the curatorial participation of not only Bill as an artist as he should, but also Bill's partner, Kira Peroff, who has always played an incredibly central and active role in the development and production and presentation of Bill's work. And here is a picture from the Everson Museum in 1974. That's Bill with his foot on the ladder. Sorry, it's a grainy picture, but there aren't many photos from this moment. This is Bill installing a work by Juan Downey, the great Chilean sculptor and video pioneer, a work called Video Transamerica's Debriefing Pyramid. And you can imagine back then when we had to hang giant TV monitors from the ceiling of a large IMP building, it was nervous making. These flat screens are a lot easier today. And here, of course, is the great Nam June Paik with his video Buddha piece, which premiered in the same exhibition video in the Art Museum in 1975. And of course, it's a profound work. You know, it's the Buddha watching himself on television. We can see this as tongue-in-cheek in the way, of course, Paik's great humor always present, but it also was profoundly about the idea of identity and about also about the narcissism that was potential in the use of or maybe misuse of video. The great Roz Krauss wrote a fantastic essay that year in October called Video and the Aesthetics of Narcissism. And here is Peter Campus in a work installed at in his survey show in 1975 at the Everson Museum, a show again that Bill worked on with me and with Peter. And Bill's use of reflection and the video camera to explore notions of identity also had a very profound impact on Bill and in his development. And of course, we can't really talk about the early days of video without talking about Bruce Nauman. Of course, this is from one of Bruce Nauman's early video installation work, video tape works from 1969, shown in Los Angeles at the Nicholas Wilder Gallery, in which he would just simply be walking across the floor in his studio back and forth for an hour in various forms, sometimes with the camera turned upside down or on an angle. Bill's work evolved in an interesting way. From in the early days, of course, as an electronic music person and as a drummer, he was interested in sound. He was interested in rhythm. He was interested in many of the distinctive features of video. But he was also, because of his interest in rhythm, interested in time. And this is a piece from 1979 called The Reflecting Pool, which was originally shown on monitors, but was cleaned up and digitally so that could be shown projected. And it's a piece in which Bill begins the exploration of the potential of exploring two different notions of time simultaneously. In other words, not only the kind of relative notion of time from the perspective of contemporary physics, but also on a more spiritual level, the way time has different aspects in different spiritual traditions. Of course, these next images are from a very famous piece that was in the retrospective, as was a reflecting pool, called The Crossing. Of course, there's that famous image of the man burning and famous image of the man disappearing in a cascade of water. These two images, of course, dealt very much with Bill's notion of the disappearance of identity, the disappearance of oneself. By this time in the mid 90s, Bill and Kira had become deeply involved in Buddhist teachings. And although these aren't specifically Buddhistic works, the notion of the disappearance of the individual's ego becomes very prominent in these two works. This is a work from a slightly earlier period, and like the work next that we'll see, Non's Triptych, dealt with an ongoing issue in Bill's work, which is, of course, notions of life and death. In this work here, Heaven and Earth, we see an image of Bill's mother, who was in a coma, and Bill made a video of with the permission of his father and brothers, and a picture of his newborn child whose eyes were just beginning to open. And these images of the grandmother, Bill's mother, and Bill's child reflecting in and out of one another, two people who would never meet in real life, whose images merged in this extraordinarily beautiful work. And here in the Nant Triptych, we again see the image on the right of Bill's mother in coma, Bill's newborn child, and another image that is very common in Bill's work, which is an image of a person being submerged in water and then coming back up through the water. This is a work, of great power, and I think it was one of the first works acquired by a foreign museum. I believe the Pompidou owns this museum. This is another work from that same period. This is called Sleepers, a series of oil barrels filled with water, in which images of sleeping figures are on monitors suspended below the water. And this was a piece that was in his exhibition in the Venice Biennale, as well as in the retrospective, in which he projected from two sides of a space through a series of veils. And so these images would meet in space. And this has a great implication in relationship to slowly tearing narrative, where we also see his use of images moving in and through one another. This is a work that was from 1992 that we first showed when I was director of the ICA in Boston, called Room for St. John of the Cross. And this was a work that dealt with the spiritual writings of St. John, who was imprisoned in a room in which he couldn't even stand, but wrote extraordinarily beautiful poetry about his soul traveling through the mountains. And in this work here, we have a projected image, very large in black and white, on a wall behind this small room with kind of wild footage of the mountainscape shot from an automobile. So it's quite disturbing and jumpy, but it's also in flight. This is a work also from that same moment called Sleep of Reason, in which the kind of explosion of dream imagery kind of comes as in a kind of surprise to the viewer in this room size installation. And here's one of my very favorite works of Bill's. This is called The Stopping Mind. This is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in Frankfurt, Germany. And it was an extremely technologically sophisticated work in which a random set of images random images from 4 laser discs. That's how early this piece was created, before there were any other ways of recording and accessing individual frames or individual portions of a video. He used 4 laser discs that would randomly bring up images from this extraordinary compilation of images which were both personal and deeply psychological, and also images of the world. Again, that relates very much to slowly turning narrative. And of course, next this is a work from Ascension. Again, that same image that we saw early on in the Nantes triptych, and his use of and his engagement in figures falling into and out of water, something we'll talk about a little later, but it comes out of a very critical childhood experience of Bill's. And then finally, a number of images from a piece that he did at the Church of San Gallo in Venice called Ocean Without a Shore, in which figures come from kind of a gray area, like you'll see in the image on the left of your screen, in a very fuzzy form made with an old surveillance camera, very low tech surveillance camera. And as they move through this wall of water, they emerge in high definition video. Here's another set of images from that extraordinary image. And this was a piece about people coming back from the dead to briefly visit the land of the living. It was a powerful and chilling and spiritually very moving work. This is 2 images from that same piece. And this is a motif Bill has worked with subsequently. And there's one more image from that where you can see the difference in these in the way these images form. And finally, now we're going to look at a work by Bruce Nauman called Eat and Die, which was a neon work. This is from that moment when all the images are up at the same time. And we'll get into why that is related to his work in this next work, Slowly Turning Narrative, which is the work that is now on view at LACMA, and hopefully this damn pandemic will lift soon enough so that you can all experience it again. Here's an image of Bill in his studio working on the installation of the piece, and you can kind of see behind the scenes what the piece actually consists of. There's this rotating wall, one side of which is a projection screen, the other side of which is a mirror. And from both sides of the room, a video projection takes place. One is a projection of Bill, also in that kind of gray and white, black and white, grainy, old-fashioned video, in which he is intoning a number of sentences or phrases about the one who agrees, the one who follows, the one who leads, the one who doubts, the one who carries, the one who resolves. He goes on and on for 29 minutes, 252 separate texts, the text of that side of the room. The other side of the room is an amazing video where we see snips of images like in Stopping Mind, but in this case that really describe an entire life, from life to death, and in the most beautiful and oftentimes exciting color video imagery. And of course, as those two images are being shown on this slowly turning screen, the notion of this narrative is broken up. It is interfered with by the turning of this screen. But it was Bill also talking about how the fact is that the narrative of our lives is not a simple one. It does not go from A to Z. It is not a linear progression. We jump in our lives, in our consciousness, in our subconsciousness. And this piece becomes a model for the subconscious mind in much the same way that the Stopping Mind at the museum in Frankfurt does. Here are another few images from this extraordinary work, Stopping Mind.
Slowly turning narrative.
I mean, from the slowly turning narrative. Thank you, Carol. And there we are. I will stop sharing and we will go back to our, there. So there's a very quick, sorry to do such a quick survey of Bill's work. We could have gone into so much more depth about any one of the works, but I wanted to give those of you who are unfamiliar with Bill's work a brief overview of why I think and how I think he got to this work, which you are lucky enough to own in your permanent collection.
For me, Bill Viola is one of those artists who both creates incredibly delectable visual experiences, but also really addresses the core issues of being a human being, what that means to be a human being in the world. But of course, I have come to that understanding of Bill's work, having seen the work. You met Bill when he was a sophomore in college, but you said you were instantly struck by the specialty of this particular person. And so tell us a little bit about what it was about Bill that first impressed you about him,
well,
what you were seeing.
When I first met Bill, he was, I mean, he's always been silly. There's always been this wonderful silly streak in Bill. I mean, Bill was one of the most fun characters to spend any time with because he had a great sense of not only a sense of humor, but a sense of the absurd at a level that made Nam June Paik respect him, and that's saying something. But also, Bill was serious about his work from the very beginning. He was serious about trying to understand something about the way the mind worked, about the way cognition worked, about how the relationship between that part of himself that was not understood by science and the parts that were increasingly well understood by science. He was interested in that liminal space between what we know and what we'd like to believe we know. And the thing about Bill that always impressed me was that from the very beginning, Bill believed that art had a transcendent capacity. And this is something that, in fact, has gotten him in trouble more times than you can imagine, because the art world seems quite evenly divided between those people who believe in art's capacity to create a transcendent experience for the viewer, an experience that the artist is able to share with the viewer, bring into a communion with the viewer, and those who have a more firmly skeptical sense of art and its linguistic origins and its cultural and the cultural construction of art, and those who have studied art from the linguistic perspective. And so Bill made a decision fairly early in his life that it's not that he's an overtly religious person, although he did become a very serious practicing Buddhist, but it's not religiosity, which I think I would find a little uncomfortable myself, but it's a kind of interest in the ineffable, in that kind of spiritual quality that defines being a human. And I think Bill's always been interested in trying to understand that. And of course, that led him into some quite profound, deep water.
Literally and figuratively.
And figuratively, yes, indeed.
And you could see this, you sensed this already when you met him as a sophomore in college.
When I saw the things he was exploring in our studio, yes. And then when I saw his first video works, his first serious video works, which occurred in like 71, 72, when he was still at Syracuse and was again mostly interested in sound and in consciousness from a kind of scientific perspective, because at Syracuse there was a building where they built a model of the human head in this building, and tried to model how people saw and heard and try to understand the kind of the psychology of perception, as well as the neurophysiology of perception. And Bill was very taken with that at that point. And like I said, as he grew as a man, and as he experienced the world of joy and loss and pain, his work deepened. Of course, there are two events that Bill talks about very openly in his work. One, of course, is his memory of a near drowning experience as a child, when his uncle reached into the water after Bill had fallen off of a boat, I think at age 8, and was slowly just drifting silently in this water until a hand reached down into the water, grabbed him, and pulled him out through the water back into the light and back to life. And he had suppressed that memory for many, many years. But when he finally found himself in touch with it, he realized what a profound impact that had on the development of his consciousness. And then, of course, an event that we all experience at some point in our lives, and that is the death of his mother, which had an extraordinarily profound impact on him. To experience and be with his mother as she passed from the land of the living into the land beyond. He was holding her hand as she died. He felt the energy leave her body. He saw what that liminal space was from his perspective. Again, not from a overtly religious space, but from a human space of, holding the hand of the woman who was so deeply important in his life, his mother, and watching her pass. And I would say that the work he made from that moment on always dealt with issues of life and death. And again, that didn't make everybody comfortable. That made many critics uncomfortable. In fact, there are many critics, even here in Los Angeles, who've never really given Bill the respect that I believe his work deserves, for being honest about his commitment to an understanding of, from his perspective, of life's potential, of art's potential in relationship to these big questions. But I remember being in a room at the National Gallery in London when Bill is the very first living artist to be offered a retrospective exhibition at the National Gallery in London, and standing with some English friends in the side of the room, we watched people walk into a room and literally break into tears. I mean, his work had that impact on people. It just grabbed people emotionally. And of course, some people think that that's wrong. Art shouldn't do that. That's intrusive. That art shouldn't try to do that. And I don't think Bill overtly tried to do that. It just does it. His work just does that to people. And I've experienced that myself. And again, I'm probably as skeptical as anybody I'm not a religious person. I'm not a believer, but I've been moved by Bill's works to tears many times.
So in 1997, or probably before 1997, since it always takes several years to put together a major exhibition, you co-organized the mid-career survey that we've referred to, that started at was organized by the Whitney. You co-organized it with Peter Sellers, with major significant contributions from Bill and Kira.
Absolutely. I mean, I think co-equal. I think that doesn't, Bill was an artist who knew what he wanted to do. And when he came to me and asked if we would do that show, because he and I had been talking about that since, for so many years. And I said, it's going to be very different putting all these installations together in one space. It's one thing to see one or two or even three. Barbara London had done a wonderful exhibition with 3 video installations at MoMA. But when you put an entire floor of the Whitney Museum together, or that entire space at LACMA together, there was something else was called for, and Bill absolutely intuitively knew what was necessary, because he and Peter both became MacArthur Fellows in the same year. So he had already developed a wonderful working relationship with Peter. And I knew Peter from his undergraduate days at Harvard, because I was teaching a senior seminar at Harvard when he was still an undergraduate there. And when I came to the ICA in Boston, I worked with Peter and gave him the entire building once to use. So we both loved Peter Sellers. Anybody who's watching this right now who's ever met Peter Sellers will not love Peter Sellers. He is one of the world's most extraordinary human beings. And so Peter understood that when we put all these works together, that we were creating something that couldn't be experienced just in a linear way. People were going to walk in and out of spaces, spend various amounts of times in various rooms. And it was much more like an opera. It was much more like the complexity of staging an opera. So Peter's intelligence and his extraordinary intuition and his immense and deep grasp of Bill's work made the ability to do this show the success it was. In fact, after I did this show, I rarely did shows when I was a museum director. You know,
that's the time.
Museum directors who are watching this know it's really hard to be a curator and a director at the same time. But when Bill asked me, there's no way I could say no to him. And this was the experience of a lifetime for me. I felt I never needed to do another exhibition after this. It was a perfect exhibition.
And did it change how you saw Bill's work, or did it just reinforce how you perceived it?
It changed many things, including how you prepared an audience to experience complex work. You know, I was still of the old school. Let's do a label in front of each work in which we have a thoughtful, explanation of the work that people are about to see. That was my attitude. I will admit it. It was a very, very old-fashioned attitude. And it was Bill and Peter, and in a conversation with me one day, we were all laughing and saying, look, when you go to Disneyland, you get on the Matterhorn ride. You don't read about it first. You have the experience. So let's trust people enough to have the experience of these works and not talk about them before they're experienced. And so we had all the text, all the explication of the work in a small space after they'd gone through all of the work. You recall we did that at LACMA as well. And it was brilliant. I have to say I'd not thought of doing that way. And it made me understand and value the intelligence and the various kinds of intelligence that our extraordinary audience brings to the experience of art. It's not always the same. Everyone comes from a different point of view, but everyone's perspective, everyone's ability to experience these works was equal. We didn't have to prepare anyone for it. And that was a major difference that for me that doing this show had. And experiencing Bill's work in this way, because I do believe that a great deal has been written about Bill's work, and over the years, people have done PhD theses on it. There've been books written about it, and many thoughtful museum catalogs with great essays have been written about it. But the work is still the work, and I feel that way about all art at this point. That talking about the work is important, absolutely. Having conversations in which we can share our experience about the work is important, but finally, we need to privilege the work itself.
Totally. Speaking of 1997, which is when that exhibition launched, and then it traveled for a couple of years, someone is asking, and it's right at this moment in Bill's trajectory, what do you see was the impact of his time as a resident artist at the Getty in 1997-98? So right at the moment of this show.
When Mr. Walsh invited Bill to come out to the Getty, he had been the curator of European paintings at the MFA in Boston when I was at the ICA. So he had seen Bill's work starting in the early 90s and had long been a fan. And John and Bill both share a belief in art's innate ability to create transcendent moments. And at that point, Bill was getting deeply into art historical works. He had done a number of them, obviously, a very important one, the greeting for the show in Venice that we also had in the show and at the Whitney show, and had gotten deeply involved in art history. Like many of us, Bill's an autodidact. I can't say that his involvement in art history and aesthetics at Syracuse, maybe it prepared him for the in-depth understanding of art history that he had developed subsequently, but he developed it slowly by looking at the real works. By the time he spent in Venice working with Maria Gloria Bicocchi at Art Tapes 22, what can prepare an artist better for a career than to spend a year and a half working, a block and a half from the Duomo in Italy, with a group of people as extraordinary as the people that surrounded Maria Gloria's operation at Art Tapes. And so when he came out to the Getty, he was totally prepared to deeply engage in those ideas of resurrection and transcendence. Again, not from a religious point of view. He's not promoting, Christianity or religion. He's talking about transformation. He's talking about transcendence. Bill did not grow up a Catholic, even though he has an Italian father. His mother, Presbyterian, and so he grew up, if anything, with a very non-Catholic background. But I think Bill, in the ways that Bill became fascinated and deeply engaged in Sufism and in Buddhism, he became deeply engaged in Christian mysticism as well, and was interested in all the great mystical traditions. Mm-hmm. And so this gave him a chance to explore that with the enormous resources of the Getty behind him.
So sort of a question in that context of looking back historically as well as contemporarily. Are there other artists out there whom you think of as having the breadth of humanistic interests that is a breadth of humanistic interests that is comparable to Bill, historical or current?
Oh, I think there are many of them. One I was thinking about this week because he was a guest of mine in my graduate curatorial seminar is the Icelandic artist Ragnar Kjartansson, whose his work, I think, affects many people very deeply, and many people find themselves extraordinarily moved by it. And in fact, thinking about the fact that I was going to be talking about Bill tonight with you all, I mentioned to Ragnar that that I wondered where he stood in relationship to this notion of belief and this notion of of human destiny and life and death. And he said, all his life until he was maybe 25, he was a deeply religious person, brought up by a mother who was born again Christian and in Iceland, and in a country that didn't have that. That was a minority kind of religious persuasion there. And he thought about that all the time. He subsequently, as kind of on a personal level, moved away from being religious in traditional sense, but he still believes that there's this kind of moment in which art can enable an audience, if kind of properly encouraged and engaged, to kind of move into a different space. And I've seen that happen a number of times. The piece he did at PS1 with that band, The National, was an amazing piece.
Yeah, I have to say, I have always thought of Goya in the context of Bill's work, just in terms of the sort of range of human interests and the depth, both the accessibility, but also the depth of meaning in the works.
That's a beautiful idea. And of course, if we're thinking about Spain and we think about mirrors, I think about, Las Meninas and the way the mirror functioned there to bring the audience into a relationship with the artist. And of course, it had different ideological implications there, but the way the mirror in Slowly Turning Narrative merges us with Bill, with his intoning of the one who kills, the one who rests, the one who dreams, the one who cuts, the one who pushes, the one who destroys. And then that mirror brings our image when it turns towards us and Bill's image together. And we are joined in this kind of journey through life and death that is the Slowly Turning Narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's another nice
I'll see your Goya with
combination. Speaking of other artists, Namjoon Paik, whom you've mentioned, if Bill is the father of video art, perhaps Namjoon Paik is the grandfather of video art. He clearly was a significant influence for Bill. Did you ever specifically discuss Pake's work with Bill?
Oh, I mean,
Many times.
Namjoon was a mentor to Bill and to me when we were both pups. And Bill stayed deeply engaged in, you mentioned a number of pieces that Bill did in different parts of the world. They were often when he was out helping Namjoon. When he did the firewalkers in Fiji, it was because he was there working on Guadalcanal Requiem with Namjoon. When Namjoon called, you went. When Namjoon asked you to be involved in a project, you were thrilled because the level that Pike worked at. And Pike is the greatest genius I've ever met, I've ever known. All the artists I've met, I've never known anyone quite as brilliant and polymathic brilliant as Namjoon. And I think that had an impact on Bill too. He realized how much he had to learn, how deeply he had to read in so many different areas. There's a great quote from Namjoon when he came back from a long trip to Japan at one point, and he said, "Oh, David, I've come back from Japan with 25 Japanese books about time, and now I don't have time to read any of them." That was the kind of classic Namjoon.
Yeah.
And of course, I think when Bill worked with me on Namjoon's exhibition at the Whitney in 1973. They spent an inordinate amount of time together, and it continued throughout Namjoon's life, unfortunately cut short by a stroke. So,
I'll just mention as an aside that within the last 6 months, actually, we acquired it out of the Felix Fair, which was right before the pandemic struck. We acquired a wonderful Namjoon Pake video piece that incorporates a little Buddha figure. So,
great.
Yeah,
you can
really
imagine
wonderful piece.
that had on Bill. Like I said, thinking about the individual, and thinking about the death of the notion of individual, of the kind of the individual as in a way was a deep part of Bill's Buddhist practice. And I think it came initially from, of course, Bill's time as a Sony artist in residence in Japan. I think when he made his first deep contacts with the Zen master who had become so important in his life. But I believe it would be wrong to say that Namjoon wasn't one of the first people to press him. There was a great teacher at Syracuse, a guy named Agananda Bharati, who wrote a book called The Ochre Robe, and it was a great Buddhist monk who turned us all on to Chayam Trungpa, the Rinpoche Trungpa, who was a Buddhist who came to America in the early 60s and was the first to understand English well enough to translate the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And so meeting Trungpa, which we all did back in the Everson days, probably also had an impact on Bill's eventual engagement in Zen Buddhism.
And did you ever travel with him? Did you go to museums with him, galleries, looking at other artists' work? What was that like?
No, our lives were physically very distant for a long time because my career took me in various places. We saw each other all the time. We would always meet because I've always felt Bill was my third brother. I have 2 biological brothers and Bill. And so we remained connected. Bill came to Venice because I was working with Maria Gloria Bicocchi on this exhibition that I did at the Long Beach Museum, Americans and Europeans in Florence. And I was at one point contemplating leaving the United States and just moving to Italy. I was at that point in my life when I was thinking, why don't I do something really crazy? But I didn't have the courage to do that. But Bill was just at a point where he needed to leave New York. He'd had it with New York City. And so I arranged for him to meet Maria Gloria and move to Venice to Florence and to have an experience that I think had a profound impact on his work. And he made a great installation work there, one of his first installation works when he was in Venice. And of course got to work with an amazing range of artists there, from Joseph Beuys to Cal Solari and Minucci and Joan Jonas and Vito Acconci and Charlemagne Palestine, and the range of people who came through that place was extraordinary. So,
but it interesting. When we were talking earlier today, I mentioned Pistoletto, and you said because of the mirrors, and you
Right.
said no, you didn't think, in fact, they had crossed
Well,
paths.
Pistoletto wasn't part of Maria Gloria's circle there, and although Bill did meet a number of the Arte Povera artists who were involved in Venice. Most of the Arte Povera people hung out in and around Turin, which is a
Mm.
very different scene, and so I don't recall Bill ever meeting Pistoletto, and I know Pistoletto did not make a video work with Bill and Maria Gloria at Art Tapes. So he may have known the work. Of course, those mirror pieces that were shown at Castelli Gallery in New York were astounding, and was still astounding today. And Pistoletto now has his own foundation and museum near Turin, which once we can travel again, I would recommend anybody who can get to Turin. There's lots of great things to see there.
So we have one comment and one question. Stephanie Barron, my colleague Stephanie Barron, is saying, sadly, it would have been this evening that a reprise of Bill Viola and Peter Sellers' collaboration, the Tristan Project, with Esa-Pekka Salonen conducting, would have been performed at Disney Hall.
Wow, I was
So,
unaware of that.
Yeah,
I went to see that production every place it took place. It was one of Esa-Pekka, what an amazing conductor he is, but what a collaboration between these three extraordinary people. And, I can't say I'm a big Wagner fan. In fact, I can say I'm not a big Wagner fan, but this piece was so amazing. And the way Bill's imagery, and Esa-Pekka's conducting of that, and of that orchestra, and Peter's kind of conceptualizing of this, that was one of the highlights in Bill's career. And I think in Peter's career and Esa-Pekka's career. I hope they'll reprise it again. I will make a trip to come and see that piece again. It was early on in the early days of of Gary's Disney Hall, and it was also a great experience for all of us to see how beautifully that space could accommodate a work as complex as theirs.
And so, keeping with that music theme, a question from our audience. You mentioned Bill Viola being in a band when he was younger. Can you talk about how music impacts his work, whether as a source of inspiration or directly incorporated?
Well, in high school and early on in college, he was in a rock and roll band, and he was a drummer. And so again, he was always into the aspect of time that's such a critical part of any kind of great music. But when he got out of college, and as he started working in his last years of college and got deeply into electronic music and synthesizer music, he became very involved in the work of a circle of composers surrounding John Cage, and was part of the Rainforest group with David Tudor. In fact, Rainforest had an enormous impact on Bill's development. Rainforest was actually presented once in the Amundsen atrium, an amazing piece in which all the musicians record wild sound separately in the environment in which surrounding environment in which the piece is going to be performed, and then bring that music, those sounds together into that space. And I think Bill learned a great deal from him. He also learned a great deal from Alvin Lucier, and remember how deeply affected he was by that video that Alvin made called Queen of the South. And of course, like anybody in the Cage and Flux and Yoko Ono Fluxus circle, we all were deeply moved by John Cage himself, and there's a certain Cagean aesthetic and understanding that there's no such thing as silence. The way Bill employs sound, by forcing us to listen to various spaces that we're in. When you're in slowly turning narrative, you have to listen. And you have to mix the sound yourself as you move from one side of the room to the other. You are the mixer, and you hear both the wild sound that accompanies the video of the world, and then you move to the other side and hear the kind of recitation, which is kind of trance-like, of Bill reciting: the one who retreats, the one who lies, the one who drives, the one who gathers, the one who carries, the one who dies, the one who fights, and that musicality is very much a part of Bill's work. Also, the way he, in works well, in all of Bill's work, sound is as important as the image. And, if you've ever been in a Bill Viola installation work, you can almost close your eyes and experience the work. I sometimes think that Bill's works would function as well for people who are not sighted as for people with sight. And today when I had the great experience, I did close my eyes and just listen to that piece for a few minutes, because it's work that has a great resonance just as an audio work.
Yeah, well, as I said to you, I think of it as an incantation or a chanting. I mean, there is that wonderful rhythmic, ongoing insistence.
It's hypnotic
to it.
also.
Hypnotic. Very good word. Yes.
And it's interesting. I wonder, I hadn't thought of this before, but in the same kind of hypnotic way that those early Vito Acconci videos would work, with Vito's deep voice kind of hypnotizing the viewer. Bill did work with Vito in Florence.
Interesting.
In a wonderful piece that involved that same kind of intoning. So there's an influence I hadn't.
Interesting. You had mentioned earlier this evening with the veils, this notion of two images merging and then passing by each other. Also in the room of St. John of the Cross, there are two disconnected images, but that come together in a way to form one narrative. Do you want to talk a little bit about that in the context of slowly turning narrative?
Bill was interested in seeing ways in which he could integrate sound and images. And so in the veiling piece, where you see these figures in this landscape moving together into this space that you can walk through, he was creating, now we have, all these kind of virtual reality and assisted reality works in which this takes place in a headset. But Bill wanted to create this in sculptural space, in a space that you could literally feel physically, and so that piece allowed him to do that, and he continued to do that. He continues to do that in works in which projected images merge in a way. In Room for St. John of the Cross, the image that's on the teeny little color monitor inside the cell on a table with a glass that's exactly half full of water, that image of this still image of the mountain, compared with the wild image of the flight of St. John's soul through space, it creates this great juxtaposition and this kind of frisson that is what makes that work. And of course, we also hear in Spanish the poetry of St. John. If you put your head in that window very quietly, you hear read in a beautiful Catalan dialect. You hear or Catalan accent. You hear the poetry of St. John being spoken. It's a very affecting work.
Speaking of frisson, Stephanie says that the Tristan project is supposed to be reprised next year, same time. So hopefully a year from now, we will all be out and about in the world again. Hopefully all of you will have had a chance to see Slowly Turning Narrative. I think we've answered all the questions that we had.
It's been my pleasure.
Well, David, I just want to say thank you. This has been extraordinary. Your personal reminiscences and also just the depth of your knowledge of Bill's work is extraordinary.
Bill is an artist who is extraordinarily dear to me. I've grown a Bill Viola beard just for this event here. I'm normally not with a beard, but this is my Bill Viola. This is my homage to Bill.
So thank you everybody again for taking the time to join us. We're going to sign off, but we can't wait to see you at LACMA, to see you in person. Wishing everybody to stay safe, good health, and a very special thank you to you, David, for joining us this evening.
My pleasure. Thanks for.
So have a great rest of the evening. Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Be well. Stay safe.
You too. Good night.